A man walks into a car dealership in Cuba and he sees that there's one car in the whole of the showroom. He walks up to the salesman and says, "Hello, I'd like to buy a car, please." And the salesman says, "Yeah, that's no problem. Come over here and I'll take your payment." So the man gives the salesman the payment. And he asks the salesman, "When will the car be ready?" And the salesman looks at him and says, "About 10 years. The man says, "Will that be morning or afternoon?" And the salesman says, "Well, it's going to be 10 years. What does it really matter?" And the man says, "I've got the plumber coming in the morning." Now, all jokes aside, I could have looked at a definition of socialism and I could have read it out. And I could have tried in my way to get the point across to you. But instead of that, I've got a gentleman here called Richard Wolfe. Now, if you are a socialist, you'll know the name of Richard Wolfe. He's, I would say, one of the world's leading proponents of socialism. He's a good communicator and he's often online, and he runs a YouTube channel called Democracy at Work. And I'm going to play you his definition of what socialism is, and then I'm going to critique it.
So the first definition is this. Capitalism is when enterprises are privately owned and operated. They're owned by individuals or groups of individuals who set them up, own them, and run them. Socialism, by contrast, in this definition, is when the government does that. It's not private groups of people, it's not private individuals, it's officials of the government who own, who operate, who run the enterprise, or at least control it.
Okay, so quite a lot of subject matter there. So what's Mr. Wolfe arguing for there? So Mr. Wolfe there's advocating for one layer of the socialist argument, which is private versus state control of entities that produce things. And you can come up with other definitions, but as he said, it's an individual or a group of individuals who will own an enterprise, and they'll own that enterprise and they'll produce goods or services. And the converse of that is with socialism, where the government would control that. And so you can choose any company you want in, your consciousness, and you can think, oh, I wonder what would happen if the government ran that and it wasn't ran by those people. So we can choose any number of things. We could choose Nike trainers. We could choose Parker pens. And so what would be the general argument against such things happening? Well, if the government were to run things, I would put it to you that nothing would work. So nothing would work at all, and everything would be completely topsy-turvy and confused, and the services would take an age to get to you. My initial joke when I started this video, it was a funny little joke, but it wasn't far off the truth. Speed, delivery of service, would be severely compromised, as would choice. So your choices would be limited. Let's say the government was in control of all footwear companies. So the government runs all footwear companies, and so whenever you need to buy some footwear, some trainers, some shoes, some boots, whatever it is, for work or for, you're doing whatever, then the government would be in charge of planning for that. So the first thing that you'd really understand about that is that there's not going to be a lot of choice. The second thing is that the quality of the service would be severely diminished. And the third thing would be the utter and complete incompetence of the state in getting that product to you. So in all elements of service delivery, in terms of speed and in terms of the cost of delivering that service, what you're looking at here is terrible service delivery in virtually every respect, an increased cost for all the services or products that you would buy, less choice, worse service, and the scale of incompetence would be on a godlike epic scale. And how do I know that? Well, I'd done a video recently about GB Energy where the government have spent £8 billion in setting a company up with no employees. So that just gives you a little indication. The old British Rail, I don't know whether anybody remembers British Rail, but there was always a joke about British Rail sandwiches, and they were awful, if you didn't know that. And so really, in terms of quality of service, there's going to be a lot lacking. And within all of this, the means of production comes up a lot. So one of the arguments that socialists will use is, you're making a wooden table. And so the employer buys the factory or rents the factory, he buys the wood in, he buys the tools. However, unless you have somebody coming in, a man or woman walking into that establishment, that business, and making the stuff, it's never going to get made. So the actual means for production is down to that individual walking into that business. So really, without the individual walking into the business and producing the wooden tables, there would be no wooden tables. And the main issue that I have with that argument is that it's the type of argument a child would make. Because in the real world, what happens? You get an enterprising individual who wants to start a business, wants to create a better life for themselves and their family, and they think, I know what I'll do. I believe that this area needs more, cheese and ham sandwiches. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to buy a place down there and we're going to start making some sandwiches, and I'm going to employ some people to come in and make these sandwiches. So you go and you get the establishment, you buy your cheese and ham and your butter and your loaves of bread, etc., and a few bits of cling film. I don't know, I've never run a sandwich shop myself, so I don't know what would be on the list there. But you've got the gentleman or lady who does that, and they're enterprising individuals, and they decide to do that. And of course the socialist argument is, but if you've got nobody in to come and cut the bread and make the sandwiches, then the business isn't going to happen. And that point is correct. However, the point that's missed out of all of that is, in order to go and get the business, that has to be rented and paid for. And often what you'll find when people are starting businesses, they'll do things like go and get huge loans against the value of their own home, or put up all of the money up front with which to start the business. And then they have to worry about things like plant and machinery, buying everything that's needed to run it, renting or buying the establishment, planning for wages for the first amount of time before the money's going to come in, going and seeing accountants, getting logos for the business, paying loads of things up front, advertising, marketing, the full plethora of things that goes in order to start a business. So all of those costs are absorbed by the business owner before anything gets going at all. And you could say, well, yeah, but, the means of production is owned by that person and it's kind of an unfair system. Well, to that argument, I would say is this. If you want to have a worker cooperative union, as socialists do say is the best way forward, if you want to do that, well, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. What you do is you get all of your buddies together, all of the ones that, you want to start this worker cooperative with, and you go and do something called starting a business. And what you do is you create a company, and then everyone together, the 5 or 10 of you that wants this fabulous utopia business structure, what you do is you all chip in and then you go and rent the place yourself and see how far you get when you've got 10 people running the company and there isn't one person at the top making the decisions, or in that type of ratio and structure. The means for people to go and do that already exists. If you wish to have your own little worker cooperative, then what I suggest you do is just go and do it. Put your own house on there. Put your own bank account on the line. Put your own money up front. You don't need to go for a job interview, anything like that. All you got to do is walk into the bank and sign on the dotted line where it says, if I don't pay these bills here and if I can't pay you the loan back here, you come and take my house. And that's the problem with the means of production argument. It completely forgets about the setup costs and the ongoing issues to do with running a business. And having run a business, I can tell you, you do wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, periodically, wondering whether it's all worth going on, whether you should even continue doing what you're doing. It's the means of production argument is a child's argument for socialism.
Okay, that's one definition. Here's a second one. Capitalism exchanges goods and services, both the resources that go into production and the products that come out of it, by means of market exchanges. Capitalism is the free market, where buyers and sellers confront each other and negotiate the terms of exchanging whatever any of them has to sell or has produced. By contrast, socialism isn't a market system. It is the government planning and controlling and directing who gets what and who gives up what for what. In other words, market versus planning, it's often called.
So I can't approach all of these arguments from every different facet, so I'm just going to give you one example relating to what Mr. Wolfe is talking about there, which is often a favourite of socialist utopias, and it does end up happening because when you have a socialist utopia, what happens is there starts to develop problems within the system, because if you don't have a free market system where goods and services are exchanged freely, what happens is the price of the goods and services gets skewed. And so if you don't allow the free market to decide the cost of something, then what happens? The government has to set the cost of it. And so what you have is something called a price control. So let's look at an example of a price control. So you can make the proclamation in your socialist utopia. You can say, I'm going to say that a loaf of bread, we either sell brown bread or we're going to sell this white bread here. So the loaf of white bread is going to cost £1. And it will always cost £1, and that's how it's going to work. And bearing in mind, governments can't work any quicker than that. There's a certain speed with which governments can move at, and they certainly can't move on every single item that you're ever going to buy. So in price control terms, the price controls in free markets are changeable all of the time because the market sets the price. But when you have to set price controls, they're not changeable. And so what happens is that the pricing becomes out of whack. So let's just say that you set the price of a loaf of bread at £1. So let's say that the part of that loaf there, if you like, the ingredients needed to make the loaf cost you 30 pence. And let's say in order to make the loaf, it costs you 50 pence. And let's say to transport the loaf, it costs you 15 pence. And then let's say to package it up, it's another 5. So the loaf itself, that's where the pound comes from. So what happens if the global price of petrol goes up, and in order for your country to buy petrol, transportation costs go up? So all of a sudden, within the system, there's a disparity. And the disparity is that the loaf of bread is now costing more than £1 to produce, but the government can't move quickly enough on all of the items that you would buy. And so what ends up happening, the state starts to lose money on producing that one item because it's had to set a price control on that item in order to maintain the system with which it's promoting. And so what happens is, over periods of time, this starts to happen on all sorts of different products, not just bread, but, whatever it is, Smarties and bags of rice or whatever it is, meat, fish, all of the vegetables, fruit, all of the things, all of the massive complex things that you would buy. You have government officials walking around with clipboards trying to analyse the cost of things. And again, I'll refer you to Great British Energy costing £8 billion, and there hasn't been anything made, anything produced, and there are currently no employees. So price controls, and this is just one example I'm taking here, price controls do not work. And the reason they don't work is because you have to allow the free market to set the price. Otherwise, everything gets out of whack. And ultimately what ends up happening is there are no loaves of bread. And there's something called bread lines. So this is something that you have seen in these socialist utopias. Eventually, when socialism hits and society gets the full bloom, the full pleasure of adopting this system, then what you start to see is lines of people waiting for food and basic necessities because the state does not know and is incapable of producing that good to pass on to the general population. As you saw as well in, with Stalin and farmers in Russia, and the famines that followed as a result of all of these policies of socialism. This is a system that is not designed in order to look after and feed people. And so for that reason, it's ridiculous to even contemplate.
Here's another one. Capitalism is when you organize production with a few people at the top making all the decisions. The owner, the chief executive, the board of directors, and the vast mass of other people called employees doing what they're told. Whereas socialism, the workers who do the work are themselves their own bosses. Oh, that's a very different definition. We're going to have to look at them because these different definitions are all cropping up without being dealt with as they really are.
No more. So, what he's saying there is, and this is just another example, you can choose any example you want from socialism, just pick a point and you just debunk it within about 20 seconds. So what he's saying is that these worker cooperatives that socialists love to talk about, that you'd have this fabulous place where everyone would be making joint decisions and that's all going to work out perfectly, rather than somebody at the top of the business who's risking his whole life, his livelihood, the security of his family and everything else like that. What you're far better to have is 30 people making democratic decisions within the business. So you have a decision to make. So the decision today is, in our sandwich shop, do we buy £50 of ham or do we get a better deal on a half a ton of cheese or whatever? And of course everyone has a different point of view. Everyone has a different opinion. So you have these democratic votes, etc. And this, of course, slows the pace of decision making down. And in essence, I don't really have to go into a lot of depth. There's a reason why football teams have a football manager. And he might have an assistant there. But I wonder what would happen if we said to those football players, hang on, when you go into the dressing room at half time, what I'd like you all to do is all of you have a nice chat and democratically come up with the best way to approach the second half. Now, I wonder if you were to compare those two different teams, the one with one football manager and the one where the 11 people on that team, and the substitutes as well, because they may have to come on. So let's see who performs better. And I would put it to you that the answer to that is relatively obvious. Now, I'm not going to go on with Mr. Wolfe. I do respect Mr. Wolfe because he's an intelligent man. He's a professor and he's spent what appears to me to be his whole life promoting this stuff. And really, we can't take anything away from that, mainly because, he's thought out his position and he seems to be quite a pleasant gentleman, however ludicrous the ideas that he's proposing are. All of that said that I've just said, these theoretical arguments around socialism, this, worker production and what would happen and state control, all of these arguments are very, very nice and very, very pleasant to have in theory. One of the major arguments that I have against socialism, outside of the normal, theoretical, childlike stuff that's just been presented by Mr. Wolfe, is that whenever socialism is adopted by society, what happens within quite a short space of time, the bodies get piled so high as to blot out the sun. So the bodies keep stacking on top of each other, and then eventually there's bodies everywhere. and you can't see for death, destruction and killing. And then what happens is there's this paranoid police state tends to ensue. And then what happens? People generally get sent off to things like death camps and gulags. If you wanted to know what socialism does to a society, if you wanted to truly understand what happens, then you just have to read the Gulag Archipelago. And that tells you everything you need to know. Solzhenitsyn, in that book, takes you on quite a tour. It's a very, very difficult book. It's not a book to be taken on lightly by any stretch of the imagination. But it's a book that everybody really has to read in order to put socialism to bed once and for all. It chronicles what it's like to live in a paranoid society, and he takes you through a range of stuff. The Confessions, which were, to my mind, one of the most brutal parts of the book, because that's the part of the book where you transition from who you were to who the new version of yourself is going to be, and that, to my mind, is always the most difficult. And then he takes you through the gulags, the death of small children, people dying as they're walking along, the disease, the utter horrific nature of everything. And really, the fact that we still talk about socialism after Solzhenitsyn's book is utterly bizarre to me. That's all the evidence you'll ever need. And if anybody can read that book and then still have, the gall to come back and tell me, I think that socialism is a good idea, then I really am at a loss as to where your grounding is in reality. In Mao's Great Leap Forward, the institutions reached such a strange state. People from universities, lecturers being brought out in front of the students to have things put on their head and to wear signs, and in a lot of cases beaten to death. North Korea, Kim Jong-un and Kim Jong-il and all of those pleasant people. Venezuela, that hasn't worked out very well, or doesn't seem to be working out very well. One nice thing that I always think when I see a student wearing a Che Guevara t-shirt, that one where he's got the kind of the hat on and his hair's all flying in the wind. It's often forgotten that Che Guevara was a serial rapist and serial murderer, a serial killer. He murdered people and took their homes, took their belongings, along with his little cadre of killers, and done unspeakable things to people generally. And I always find it quite pleasant when I see a student wearing such a t-shirt. And if you're a socialist, you've probably got one of these t-shirts. So I do hope you like wearing those t-shirts, because the face on your t-shirt is the face of a man that's murdered so many people as to be unimaginable. And so all of these things, the nice little arguments relating to, the means of production, and should we have worker cooperatives, and I wonder what the pros and cons of price controls are, and I wonder what the different types of socialism is. I wonder how it all works. If you've ever read the Communist Manifesto, you'll know what a despicable human being Karl Marx was. The man couldn't hold down a job, which is just as well, because that relates quite nicely to socialism. When a woman came to Karl Marx and told Karl Marx, I should say, that she was pregnant, to all stories that seem to come out, I believe he pushed her down the stairs and kicked her out the front door and told her never to come back and see him ever again. So he sounds like a pleasant chap who was unable to hold down a job, as I say. And there's 1,000 different facets to socialism, communism and all the various little things, Trotskyism and Leninism, and I'm sure all of these strains are familiar to those people who understand socialism better than me. But to me, socialism equals death. And if there are any socialists there listening and still here, which I doubt because they'll probably be too annoyed to listen to this, what I'd like you to do is tell me once in history where socialism has worked, where it hasn't produced death on an unimaginable scale, and where it's worked to make society fairer for everyone. You know, the luxury belief class, the luxury socialists, the champagne socialists out there. Yeah, I love those terms, especially champagne socialist. It says it all. Luxury socialist. You know, in the modern day, a lot of students who promote socialism, I find that really funny. It's this luxury belief class, this elitism, where people are allowed to hold beliefs and it's never, ever, ever going to come to the cold light of day. I will say that if you are a young person, I forgive you for socialism. It's been said that if you're not a socialist when you're 20, then you don't have a heart. But if you're not a Tory by the time you get to 50, you don't have a head. And so I'm quite willing, in that vein, to forgive you for being a socialist if you are younger. But if you're over the age of 30, I'm not going to call you names. I just think that you are suffering from a massive delusion if you believe that socialism would fix any of your problems or any of the problems in society. And it's a ridiculous thing to even present to people because of the death that always occurs. Thanks very much for your time. I appreciate it.